collapsing under the weight of what some days seemed like never-ending snowfall. "Not yet, Hank." She crossed her arms. "What have I told you about using my first name?" His cheeks darkened under his scruffy gray beard. "My apologies, Miss Clementine." "Just Clem is fine," she reminded him, as she had periodically since she hired him. After a small nod, he glanced toward the dead bodies on the tables and grimaced, pulling the brim of his hat lower. Clementine had seen him shield his eyes that way before around the dead. Over the last few months, Clementine had learned that Hank Varney was not a man to be measured as average. He'd come to the Black Hills months before the smallpox epidemic to load very large bags with free gold and to conquer the new frontier, or possibly just for the gold. But the gold had proved difficult to procure, and the touch of Midas had eluded him. Hour after hour of picking, shoveling, and sluicing demonstrated both his ineptitude for mining and the pure bust his claim turned out to be. With a little luck, a day's work might result in a small bag of dust and the occasional picker, which he would promptly deposit at Bell Grand Theater or Yellow Strike Saloon, Hank's preferred gambling and drinking establishments in Deadwood, leaving not quite enough coins to silence his often grumbling belly. Clementine had watched Hank for some time until she'd felt comfortable with her idea to take him on as her assistant. From what she'd witnessed, he had no real vices to speak of other than drinking and gambling. On top of that, he went out of his way to help a stranger when he could. He was the trustworthy sort, she was fairly sure. She walked around the hairy feet of the big corpse, patting Hank on the back as she passed. "Not too much fire. We don't want to help these poor buggers along any quicker than is natural." Clementine did what she could to control the stench of decomposing flesh in the pyre. The cold weather helped, but the unpleasantness of her task had soaked into the clapboard walls and anything else in the room that was semi-permeable. On warm days, Hank would say, "Skunk cabbage is bloomin' again," plug his nose and pretend to gag. "Lucky it's freezing outside." Hank stood. He made a point of keeping his chin and gaze lifted, probably to avoid the bodies on her tables. He looked toward the front window, which she draped with thin white curtains that blocked the view into the room while still allowing plenty of light to enter. "Snowin' so's can't hardly see across the street. It's a pain in my backside. I got to get Fred the mule and that wagon moved before I can't find him." "There's an apple in the bowl on the sideboard for your sidekick." Clementine was fond of Fred the mule, as Hank liked to call him. He had more personality than most of the scrubby miners and slick gamblers she'd met, along with a belligerent streak that served him well. Nowadays, the mule lugged more bodies than mining equipment. His job pulling Hank's wagon took him all around Deadwood, south to Lead, and clear out to Slagton when necessary. "Let me take a closer look at this big fellow, and then we can move him to the shed. Maybe stack him on top of the other beefy one." Rubbing her hands together, she tried to warm her palms and fingers. Not that her customers ever complained about her cold touch. The lack of protests in her establishment was one of the benefits in working with the non-living. "Yes, ma'am," Hank said, his gaze still focused on the falling snow. "We're getting full up out there." "I'll talk to Ling and Gart about gathering the deceased from the shed, but I doubt they'll be willing to brave this storm." Waiting on the pair of gravediggers had become a pastime for Clementine. She paid them decently enough, but they weren't what could be considered reliable. From what she'd witnessed, most of their money went to liquor, women, and opiates. However, in her line of work, beggars couldn't be choosers. Most folks were too superstitious to touch the dead, let alone spend days and nights digging graves in the bone orchard. Hank was a golden nugget on that score. He didn't like watching her work on the bodies, but he had no trouble with moving them from here to there.